resistant, and then he comes to really appreciate the robot for unusual reasons, which I won't get into. And the other one with a science fiction element is called Safety Not Guaranteed, which involves an ad placed in a weekly newspaper that wants a companion for going back in time. Safety not guaranteed. So someone from the paper tries to find this person, and it's what happens when they find this guy, this time traveler, and what goes on with him. Really a charming little film.
And I gather there is another feature film, a drama, that is the talk of the festival.
Yes, there always is one film that's the talk of the festival, and if there's not one, people create one, but this time there is genuinely one. It's called Beasts of the Southern Wild. It's a hard film to describe. It's kind of hypnotic filmmaking. It's set in a remote community in a Louisiana bayou. It's about kind of a 6-year-old girl who has to face the end of her world and possibly the end of the world as we know it. It's really kind of phantasmagorical filmmaking, kind of part mythological, part, Mad Max. It's really an unusual story, really vibrantly done, and it's just, that's the one everyone's talking about. If you stop people on the street who have seen a lot of stuff, that's the one they point to.
The Beasts of the Southern Wild, that's the big talk. But always at Sundance, there are great documentaries. It's a strong category at this festival. Tell us about what's there this year.
Yeah, no, I think that documentaries are the things I look forward to personally the most. I think this has got to be as good a documentary festival as there is in the world, really. Spectacular stuff. The range this year has been exceptional. There's a film called Room 237 about the obsessive interest people take in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, the strange messages they see there, and running all the way to something called The Law in These Parts, which is an Israeli film that's a really fascinating, meticulous kind of dissection of how the law in the occupied territories came to be. But the two films that really, I think, struck me most here, that are probably the two films people are talking about most, one is called Ai Weiwei, Never Sorry. And it's a look at really a very close look at the remarkable life and personality of the Chinese artist dissident Ai Weiwei, who had just been kind of a name to me. I hadn't really known that much about him. And the filmmaker Alison Klayman spent 3 years with him. And you really get a really detailed portrait of what he's like as a person and what he's trying to do in China. The other film is much different, much more disturbing. It's a documentary about a European man who managed to pass himself off as a teenage boy from San Antonio, Texas, who had run away a few years earlier. It's about how he convinced the family of this boy that he is that person returned. And it's really a film about belief, about the things we do when we want to believe something. It's just an astonishing look at human nature, and it really just kept me, riveted.
Kenneth Duran, speaking to us from Park City, Utah at the Sundance Film Festival. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Renee.
And of course, Ken reviews movies for Morning Edition and the Los Angeles Times.
We'll have the latest business news on the way in about 10 minutes on Morning Edition on 90.1 WABE, your home for the classics and NPR News.
Support for WABE comes from North Highland, a business consulting firm that can help clients create and implement strategies to achieve business and financial objectives. North Highland, globally local. Online at northhighland.com.
Atlanta weather, a rainy day with scattered showers in the forecast. High in the upper 60s this afternoon. Showers and thunderstorms tonight. Low around 50. Becoming partly cloudy tomorrow. Some light rain in the area now. 55 degrees. The time is 7:40.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. Good morning. I'm Renee Montaigne.
And I'm Steve Inskeep. This week, Tibetans protested against Chinese rule. They held some of the largest protests in 4 years. According to Tibetan right groups, Chinese security forces opened fire on demonstrators, killing at least 4 people and wounding more than 30. The demonstrations were inspired in part by a disturbing new trend in Tibetan dissent. Tibetan people lighting themselves on fire. NPR's Frank Langford reports.
By most accounts, this week's demonstrations began with leaflets. They were distributed in the Tibetan region of China's far western Sichuan province. At least one urged people to protest Chinese rule by not celebrating Chinese New Year, which began Monday. The leaflet also contained something certain to stir strong feelings. Kate Saunders, who works with the International Campaign for Tibet, explains.
An unidentified Tibetan author was saying that he or she was preparing to set fire to themselves.
Since last March, 16 Tibetans have doused themselves with fuel and set themselves aflame to protest China's restrictive political and religious policies. This video shows a Tibetan teenager lying on a street, his blackened body still smoking. Women scream, and one repeats the name of Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama. In part to mourn the loss of these people, hundreds staged public protests earlier this week. Kate Saunders describes what happened when Tibetans gathered in a public square in Suna County on Tuesday.
Troops attempted to lock down the area. Troops fired at the Tibetans. It was a scene of terrible panic and fear. At least one Tibetan was shot dead, others were shot. And we heard from Tibetan sources that after this occurred, the square was covered in blood, and there were tear gas canisters left on the scene.
China's government insists Tibetans started the violence. Xinhua, the government's official news agency, says a Tibetan mob attacked a police station with, quote, gasoline bottles, knives, and stones. Xinhua says 14 police were injured. Confirming the facts is extraordinarily difficult. Chinese security forces have blocked roads and prevented reporters from entering the region for months. NPR made 30 calls to hotels, restaurants, and other businesses in the area with no answer, suggesting the government is blocking outside calls as well. Lobsang Sangay is the Prime Minister of Tibet's government in exile in India. He says the self-immolations over the past year mark a distressing turn for the Tibetan freedom movement in China.
It's really sad, it's really tragic that Tibetans are looking to such extreme measures. Given a choice, anyone would like to leave. No one wants to die.
People are desperate, and that seems to be particularly true inside monasteries and some nunneries.
Robert Barnett runs the Modern Tibetan Studies program at Columbia University. He says since 2000, China has imposed particularly harsh conditions on some Tibetan areas in Sichuan province.
Attacks on the Dalai Lama personally, demanding that monks denounce the Dalai Lama, so they've lost the support and patience of people in those areas.
China's government blames the unrest and self-immolations on the Dalai Lama. The Communist Party claims he encourages the suicides to foment rebellion, something the Dalai Lama has denied. Earlier this week, U.S. State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland criticized China's latest crackdown.
We have repeatedly urged the Chinese government to address its counterproductive policies in the Tibetan areas, which have created tensions and threaten the unique religious, cultural, and linguistic identity of the Tibetan people.
China shows no sign of changing its approach. Tibetan activists say the areas where the protests occurred remain under lockdown. They also say they expect more demonstrations in the coming days. Frank Langford, NPR News, Shanghai.
In the wake of the Arab Spring, many of the emerging democracies in North Africa are looking across the Mediterranean to Turkey in search of a model. Still, that model may be flawed. Some analysts in the region question Turkey's human rights record and its dealings with the media. Critics say the government is using Turkey's slow-moving and sometimes opaque justice system to stifle dissent. Media advocates in Turkey are frustrated both with the government and international media groups, which in their view understate the number of imprisoned journalists. NPR's Peter Kenyon found this report from Istanbul.
Okay, now you will have original Istanbul breakfast, please.
Yonca Shook welcomes a visitor to her Istanbul apartment on a recent morning, setting the breakfast table with cheese, homemade jam, tomatoes, and the ubiquitous Turkish shimit, a sesame-crusted cross between a bagel and a pretzel. Also bustling around are Yonca's young daughter, an attention-seeking golden retriever, and John, a lawyer trying to get her husband, journalist Ahmed Shook, out of prison. The arrest of Shook and longtime investigative journalist Nedim Shanner nearly a year ago provoked a large public outcry, but since then